Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Conversation of Power. In today's conversation, we are definitely one of the most important country around the world, the North Korea, and we are going to discuss through the book of Dr. George Anderson, the North Korean nuclear decisions and everything through our conversation here. And today, I'm joining by Dr. George Hutchinson. He's the operational energy prototyping lead within the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy Resilience Optimization. He recently served as a senior regional planner, supporting and advising on U.S. Air Force basing issues in the Republic of Korea. Prior to that, Dr. Hutchinson, specializing in wargaming and energy policy, a consultant at the Pentagon. He served in the U.S. Air Force as both a commissioned and non-commissioned officer, holding roles as a logistics readiness officer, Northeast Asia Foreign Area officer, and Korean linguist. He is also the editor of the International Journal of the Korean Studies and a board member of the International Council on Korean Studies. Dr. Hutchinson is the author of the North Korea's nuclear decisions and strategies, sovereignty, legitimacy, and the bomb. It's published by Routledge in 2024, the books that we are going to discuss about today. And also has Army of the Indoctrinated, the Suryang, the Soldier, and the Information in the KPA, Committee for Human Rights on North Korea, in 2022. His work has been published in the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings, Air Force Journal of Logistics, International Journal of the Korean Studies, and Marine Corps University Press, as well as in reports by Korea Economic Institute of America. He also holds a PhD from George Mason University's Sher School of Policy and Government and a master's in logistic management from the U.S. Air Force Institute of Technology. And Dr. George, thank you for joining me today in my Conversational Power episode. And congratulations on the publishing on your new book.
Thank you very much, Lokman, and Happy New Year. Thanks for having me.
Yes, happy New Year. And let's just start to ask my questions about your amazing book. You opened the book by tracing Korea's history from tributary to colony and to divided state. So how does this historical trauma of the country, specifically the fear of losing the sovereign control again, explain why North Korea used nuclear weapons, not just as military tools, but as the only guarantee of their existence? What will be your comment?
Okay, so lots to unpack here. In terms of sovereignty, in the context of the Korean Peninsula and historical trauma, the issue is really the full sovereign national Korean sovereignty as a nation is still unresolved. So Korea has been caught really since the late 19th century in a recurring vortex of international world order change, where one international structure collapses, the next one emerges. And each time this happens, the dominant legitimacy principle of the new order, what counts as the legitimate sovereignty rule of that order, or the sets of rules, has in every instance worked against Korean political aspirations rather than in support of them. So that repeated misalignment is essentially the trauma. Korea's status has simply never been fully settled on Korean terms due to external structural constraints. And I want to clarify that because there's a key point that often gets missed. And this is in the Westphalians, in the IR community, in the Westphalian sense of sovereignty. Mutual recognition of equal and independent states with clear borders. In that context, Korea has arguably never been fully sovereign. So it's moved from being a tributary to China. This is beginning, in the collapse of the East Order in Asia in the late 19th century. It moves from being a tributary to China, then to a colony of Japan, and then to the divided nation of Koreans that persists today. And so as a territorial bound nation, it's never experienced a stable moment where from the international community standpoint, where its sovereignty, its full territorial sovereignty was self-defined, internationally uncontested, and accepted, structurally secure from the the international orders as we've seen them unfold since the late 19th century. So for North Korea, the fear isn't simply losing sovereignty again. It's that, and it's a fine point, but it's that sovereignty and legitimacy have never been fully or conclusively resolved at all. And so this is continuing to hang in the balance. Going into it just in a little extra detail, looking at each order, we've got the post-Napoleonic order, 1815 to 1914, and this system favors territorial over nationalist claims. It was Metternich's response, essentially, to Napoleon's nationalism run amok in the 19th century. And it was supposed to create stability in that order. And so, but Japan, absorbs essentially the legitimist rules of the order, and through treaties and warfare uses these principles in an extreme way to its advantage, annexes Korea in 1910. Then we move to a post-World War I order, 1919 to 1945. And this system pivots, the pendulum swings from a territorial response to a nationalist response. So you have a Wilsonian national self-determination. Now, in theory, this should help Korea. But in practice, it's applied very selectively, and Japan keeps Korea. Korea's nationalism is acknowledged at the Paris Peace Conference rhetorically, but it's ignored politically on the world stage. And then in the post-World War II, the Cold War order, 1945 to 1991, the international system again swings, and it's a response to nationalism once again run amok, Hitlerian Germany, swings back to a focus on territory, territorial expansion, territorial partition, and formation of ideological blocs led by the US and USSR. So this results in Korea being divided at the 38th parallel. So you have this strange mix in 1945 where national unity is abundant. It exists in liberated Korea after the atomic bombs are dropped on Japan, but it's subordinated to these two ideological camps, and division becomes institutionalized from that point forward. And so moving to the system after that, the post-Cold War in 1991 through the present, this system pivots again. It moves from territory. It goes and it pivots to national claims of legitimacy. Germany reunifies. The Soviet Union breaks up into 15 independent countries. In this order, it would have made perfect sense for Korea to follow suit and reunify on for nationalist reasons along those principles. But instead, oddly, both Koreas enter the United Nations as separate states, leaving the question of full Korean sovereignty hanging in the balance as we know it, and it remains that way today. And the key takeaway is the Korea question, Korea as a fully unified sovereign territory remains unresolved. And so for North Korea, this trauma that you brought up in your question, it peaks in 1989. Leninist regimes are collapsing across Eastern Europe. South Korea establishes diplomatic relations with the Soviet successor state, Russia and China, and the former socialist allies in Eastern Europe. So North Korea,
Dr. George, I think that in the time, it coincident with the Gulf War.
Yes,
the U.S. later. Yes, this is interesting time. Not only the collapse of the Soviet Union.
it absolutely is. And so from Pyongyang's realpolitik perspective, the world order that began in 1989 essentially spells doom for the survival of the Kim regime. And this is where North Korea's nuclear program becomes transformative. And this is where it gets into the book, this whole notion of nuclear, the tie between the nuclear program and legitimacy. For the first time ever in the early 1990s, the United States agrees to negotiate directly with North Korea. And this is recognition that Korea has never had before. And it's been trying to get to bilateral talks with the United States for decades. And now, because of its nuclear program, the U.S. is willing to talk. And those talks which were essentially over the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency's ability to go in and monitor its nuclear program. They established this template moving forward for North Korea. And so this nuclear capability creates leverage. Leverage produces engagement with the United States, and then engagement confers legitimacy. And this negotiating template essentially holds from the early 1990s to 2019, when communications break off, essentially, between North Korea and the United States. So nuclear weapons become proof. They can't be ignored any longer. Insurance, essentially, against coercion, and a means to be heard in a system that's never really listened to it before.
And Dr. George, in chapter 3 of your books, you use the phrase planting the seeds of the nuclear latency. Many people think the nuclear crisis started in the 90s, but you trace it back much further. Was the decision to pursue nuclear capability inevitable from the moment that the armistice was signed after the Korean War?
You're right that most locate the first North Korean nuclear crisis, the 1993 and 1994 window, and that's accurate in a narrow sense. By then, the CIA had assessed that North Korea had separated enough weapons-grade plutonium for a couple of nuclear devices. And this is when tensions escalate, a crisis develops after inspections from the IAEA, gained access to the Yongbyon complex, and pressed for inspections of suspected nuclear waste facilities. So North Korea threatens to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1993, and this triggers the crisis. But to your question, and I think the point maybe you were driving in the question, that's the culmination really of a very long story. This crisis is not the beginning. And so, yeah, the pursuit of nuclear capability was inevitable from, in my estimate, from the moment that the armistice was signed. In fact, the foundations were laid even before the armistice and even before formal establishment of the DPRK. Surprisingly, I think that's one of the most underappreciated aspects of North Korea's nuclear trajectory and how it begins. Kim Il-sung University was established in the fall of 1946. This is before the DPRK even formally exists. And this matters because nuclear programs, they don't spontaneously begin with reactors and fissile material. They begin with the building blocks: physics, mathematics, institutional capacity. And so in December of 1952, during the Korean War, but before the armistice is signed, North Korea establishes the Academy of Sciences. And then under the armistice, during the armistice time, North Korea formalizes its nuclear research by inaugurating the Atomic and Nuclear Physics Research Institute under the Academy of Sciences. And so it's at this point that North Korea has the capacity building blocks for a nuclear program. But what it lacks, it's got the building blocks, but what it lacks is the human capital and the technology, trained atomic physicists, and actual material, reactors, fissile material. And this gap is filled by the Soviet Union in 1955. Pyongyang and Moscow sign an agreement, technical exchange. And then in 1956, North Korea signs on to the Soviet-led Joint Institute for Nuclear Research, the JINR. And this is critical because the JINR is effectively the Soviets' counterpart to President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace initiative. And so membership in this organization, there were 11 founding members, North Korea was one of them. It gives North Korea access to reactor science, nuclear theory, professional services, and help from the Soviets. And then later, a few years into this relationship, they obtain a 2-megawatt nuclear reactor, a research reactor, to conduct pilot scale research. So from this point forward, North Korea is no longer merely interested in nuclear science. It's structurally positioned for what, in the proliferation community is known as nuclear latency. And so from this point, this term, planting the seeds of nuclear latency, it means having the knowledge the institutions and the infrastructure to move forward on nuclear weapons if and when the strategic environment demands it.
And Doctor, you distinguished between the general ambition and a specific proliferation decision made by Kim Il-sung. What was the tipping point for the specific geopolitical trigger during the Cold War that convinced him he could no longer rely on conventional alliances and need his own bomb?
So one of the things that I do in the book is to try and clearly pinpoint Kim Il-sung's proliferation decision. So he's already made a capacity decision, basically a nuclear latency decision, capability decision, but he moves on to a proliferation decision. Now, many states during the Cold War pursued nuclear science research, as we know, research reactors, even the fuel cycle. But what I think matters analytically, though, is when a leader decides that a latent capability is no longer sufficient and that weaponization has to be pursued. And I think for Kim Il-sung, this decision crystallizes in the late 1960s and then early 1970s. And it's really driven by three geopolitical shocks. The first and probably the most underappreciated one was the establishment of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the context, I think, really matters here because the Yongbyon complex, the storied Yongbyon complex where North Korea has conducted its illicit nuclear activities, this is commissioned in 1965. And so the Soviet-supplied 2-megawatt research reactor goes critical, so it begins operating and creating fission in 1965, but it becomes fully operational, which means it's ready to produce plutonium potentially in 1967. So there's a 2-year period from 65 to 67. And this is the exact moment when the United States and Soviet Union are finalizing negotiations on the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So this is key because as a landmark international treaty that's going to be accepted by the UN and then monitored through the IAEA, this locks in the nuclear status of states that tested nuclear weapons before 1967, something North Korea wasn't able to do. And it criminalizes future weapons pursuits by everyone else. So from Pyongyang's perspective, what had once been an open technological horizon is suddenly slamming shut. And here's the critical asymmetry. The Soviets were the ones, rather than the United States, who were very enthusiastic supporters of the NPT. They were the ones that began pressing their allied states to sign up, and they were the ones that were restricting their allies from really cooperating beyond those rudimental first steps under the JINR as far as nuclear cooperation. The US, meanwhile, under President Nixon, was primarily concerned with geopolitics, higher level geopolitics, détente, balancing against the Soviet Union, rapprochement with China, and of course, disengagement from Vietnam. And so time-consuming multilateral non-proliferation enforcement simply wasn't something Washington was really focused on at the time. And for Kim Il-sung, this sends a powerful signal. His principal security patron, the Soviet Union, the country that he's gotten his technology from, is now enforcing an international treaty is going to preclude him from moving forward with nuclear activities, while his principal enemy, the United States, is focused on a different realm of things involving higher order geopolitics. And in the meantime, kind of ignoring South Korea's interests. And South Korea is racing ahead. And this is the second trigger as far as what's happening. This is south of the demilitarized zone. By 1968, South Korea is already planning large-scale nuclear energy development in the form of, at the time, it was 500, much larger now, but 500 megawatt nuclear energy reactors. So South Korea is quickly advancing in the nuclear realm. 1971, President Nixon withdraws 20,000 troops from South Korea. It's the entire 7th Infantry Division. And this terrifies the South Korean president, Park Chung-hee. His response was to launch a covert nuclear weapons program using really the South Korea's advancing nuclear energy program as cover. And right at the same time in 1971, South Korea's Kori-1, which was their first nuclear plant, was launched. So it begins the very same year. So Park's got perfect cover for this. This program is launched. It was eventually shut down. Pressure by the United States finally caught on. But from Pyongyang's vantage point, the U.S. commitment right at this point appears very fluid. South Korea is racing ahead with its weapons program. Yeah, and this is the Kori-1 was really the first of many plants that were going to be built in the 1970s. Now, the third trigger is the nuclear abandonment by the Soviets. So the Soviets, during this period of panic, essentially, on Kim Il-sung's part, the Soviets, and again, in a bid to uphold the NPT, consistently rebuffed requests by North Korea for, on the surface, what were nuclear energy. It was a nuclear energy help. Now, the Soviets were suspected that the North Koreans wanted to develop nuclear weapons, and that was primarily the reason they didn't want to help them. But by the early 1970s, Kim Il-sung's losing room to maneuver. The Soviets are rebuffing all of his requests for nuclear assistance. South Korea is racing ahead technologically, not to mention threatening to potentially restart a nuclear weapons program. And then China and U.S. relations are warming. So for Kim Il-sung, nuclear latency alone is not enough. And so it's this period where a pivot to proliferation happens, and he directs this shift using indigenous resources. What happened in a nutshell was North Korea winds up joining the IAEA in 1974 due to pressure from the Soviets. And it's a very limited membership. They wind up signing a trilateral safeguards agreement, giving the IAEA the right to monitor, to go into Yongbyon, but only to monitor the activity of that small 2-megawatt reactor. So very, very limited in scope. But what it gives North Korea is vast reams of data and technical help at the IAEA's library in Vienna. So North Korea dispatches a team to Vienna. The team collects information, and they find data relating to a design, an old UK, United Kingdom design, the Calder Hall, that perfectly is suited to the indigenous resources of North Korea, uranium and graphite. And so in 1979, armed with this design, the North Koreans begin secret construction of this 5-megawatt reactor in Yongbyon, optimized to produce weapons-grade plutonium. And why is this such a major decision, as pointed out in the book? Because it's at this point that Kim Il-sung, he's crossing this threshold, harnessing manpower, resources, operational secrecy, both with the Soviet Union and the international community, and political capital toward this nuclear weapons objective. So that's the proliferation decision.
And Dr. Joel, when we look at to the chapter 5 of your books, you contrast Seoul's Cold War triumph with Pyongyang's nuclear subterfuge. So is it accurate to say that North Korea's nuclear program was actually an admission of defeat or realization that they had lost economic and diplomatic race against its South?
Yes. In one sense, Lokman, North Korea's nuclear program can be understood as an admission of defeat. This is counterintuitive. It can be acknowledged as a defeat, but only if we're precise about what kind of defeat we're talking about. It clearly wasn't a military defeat. It was a defeat essentially in the Cold War competition of, legitimacy and performance of political systems. So during the Cold War, North and South Korea weren't just rivals. They were forward outposts within their respective camps, ideological camps. And so there was a competition going on, essentially, a competition of legitimacy. Each regime claimed in its constitution, respective constitution, to be the sole legitimate Korean state. And so that competition unfolded across economic metrics, diplomatic reach, how it could influence the diplomatic community, and then through international recognition at the UN, legitimacy. And so by the 1990s, it was increasingly clear that South Korea was winning this. Its economy was growing rapidly. It was integrating into global economic markets. But more importantly, it was gaining diplomatic legitimacy, not only across the non-communist world, the US-led world, but across the communist world as well. And maybe even more crucially, South Korea had already demonstrated the ability to pursue a nuclear weapons program. So by 1989, the pivotal year, South Korea had, at that point, 9 nuclear power plants in operation. And those plants were producing about half the electricity in the country. Not to mention the fact that its growing economy, international prestige was outpacing North Korea on a tremendous scale, and this gap was growing. So the legitimacy contest of the Korean War, or of the Cold War, Seoul had effectively won it. North Korea had hitched its wagon to a loser. The Soviet Union, at a time when the Soviet Union was in steep decline, and by 1989, we're at an inflection point. And this signals doom for Kim Il-sung, because you've got the collapse of East European communism. South Korea's diplomatic penetration now is moving into the former communist bloc in Eastern Europe. And the implications are existential for Kim Il-sung's survival. His alliance guarantees are evaporating. His ideological capacity is collapsing. And so he understands that the Cold War battle for legitimacy is over. And this is when North Korea's nuclear program takes on a completely different meaning. So because having lost the battle for legitimacy, and then now upon entering this new order with the collapse following the events of '89, the collapse of the Soviet Union, nuclear weapons become a tool to prevent a final defeat in the overall war. So they've lost the battle, but the overall war is still going on. And this is going to help, nuclear weapons are going to help Kim Il-sung prepare for future battles of legitimacy. So for North Korea, in this newly forming international order of the early 1990s, nuclear weapons provide regime survival in the absence of allies, China and Russia, or the Soviet Union, and then coercive leverage over stronger strategic adversaries like the United States, and a way to remain strategically relevant. So yeah, North Korea's nuclear program reflects an admission that it lost the Cold War competition with the South, but it also represents its refusal to disappear, even after losing that battle.
And in the core argument of your book, North Korea's nuclear path to the legitimacy, this is very important. In the post-Cold War world, how exactly does this possessing and nuclear weapons provide legitimacy to a regime that is otherwise isolated and economically struggling? What is the secret of the nuclear weapons give legitimacy?
Could you, I lost the question on that. Can you ask me that one more time? I'm so sorry.
I just ask about the core argument of your books, North Korea's nuclear path to the legitimacy. In the past Cold War world, how exactly does the possessing a nuclear weapon provide legitimacy to a regime that is otherwise isolated and economically struggling?
What it does is it provides an opportunity, essentially, to move forward with a capability that essentially prevents its demise, if that makes sense. I think.
Is it possible, Dr. George, is it possible to say they get, we are talking about a country they isolated and economically struggling, but they still find a way through the proliferation. They get advantage through the proliferation and make the contact around the world through the proliferation.
Yeah, I mean, North Korea's ability to navigate around its disaster. I mean, it was entering a famine essentially during that time, and its ability to navigate around all of this was really based on a tenacious adaptation to what was going on in the world that time, and really without regard to its own people. It wasn't so much concerned about what struggle the people were going to go through economically, but it was able to sort of cling to its original objectives, its goals, to on a larger scale, or on a more strategic scale, to get to using its nuclear weapons program to get to the negotiating table with the United States and negotiate, advance its nuclear weapons program forward, essentially, and get the United States kind of, get this pattern going with the U.S. where it would potentially get the United States to consider a peace agreement and then eventually withdrawing its troops. But it was able to do this really through just tenacity and persistence.
And we often, when we talking about the North Korea, we often hear the brinkmanship, the terms of the brinkmanship used to describe North Korea as a crazy country or actor. But in chapter 7, you analyze it alongside diplomacy. So do you see the brinkmanship as a rational, calculated diplomatic strategy rather than an unpredictable aggression?
Yeah, now this is with regard to Korea, you're talking brinkmanship and whether or not this is North Korea behaving in sort of a crazy manner. Well, I think when it's used to describe North Korea, the word brinkmanship, and that's the term used. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, so the term brinkmanship, when it's used, is often applied in an unhelpful way. I think it's analyzed in an unhelpful way, as it's viewed sort of as an emotional, irrational, and almost suicidal response from North Korea. But in fact, it's very rational and very disciplined. It's an approach that North Korea systematically used to adhere to its negotiating objectives while advancing its nuclear program. So for North Korea, I think it's best understood as a form of coercive diplomacy. So for for folks engaged in IR, rationality is a very important thing. It's rational behavior essentially designed to manage risk and shape negotiations and control tempo towards its goals, of which had always been, again, getting to the negotiating table with the United States, signing a peace agreement that would replace the armistice, and then seeing to the withdrawal of U.S. forces. Now, the terminology's changed over the years, but those are essentially the same goals that North Korea's had. And the way to get to direct negotiations with the U.S., by exploiting tensions over its nuclear program. And so North Korea's brinkmanship pattern, we said that it emerges clearly during the first nuclear crisis of the 93-94 timeframe. And this is the moment when North Korea discovers that controlled risk can compel negotiations with the United States. So the strategy becomes risk acceptance. And so how much risk was Pyongyang willing to tolerate? and how much risk was the United States wanting to avoid. And so Pyongyang has shown that it's often willing to tolerate much higher levels of danger and uncertainty than other countries, certainly than its adversaries, the United States, making it seem sort of irrational, using the U.S. planners, policymakers, using their template, to gauge risk. It makes North Korea seem irrational when in fact it's a very rational move. And that's the asymmetry in the foundation of brinkmanship. So for North Korea, this turned into a repeatable cycle. It would start with some sort of impasse. Talks would stall, inspections would get resisted. North Korea would block the IAEA, or agreements would become strained. Tensions, begin to rise. And then there's escalatory signaling, provocations, threats, missile tests, announcements of withdrawal from agreements. This is all carefully timed and calibrated from North Korea's standpoint. And then once at the brink, once arriving at that point of brink, where the brinksmanship element comes in, North Korea would inject diplomatic leverage into the picture. So North Korea would probe diplomatic back channels and then use their nuclear capability as bargaining currency. And then this would classically result in North Korea offering prospects, offering to freeze, dismantle, or cap parts of its nuclear program. And then the bargaining over this would stretch out over time and delaying things. And then through these delayed negotiations, agreements would finally be reached, but those agreements would be vaguely worded, politically fragile, or completely riddled, with implementation gaps. So, but for North Korea, time is gained, ambiguity is created, and then momentum winds up being managed. And throughout this entire cycle, what's happening? Nuclear and missile development continues chugging along in the background. And so why has brinkmanship worked? So it's not crazy, it's rational. Why has it worked? Because during the first nuclear crisis, North Korea did not yet have usable nuclear weapons. They had a capability that was developing them, but they didn't have the actual weapons. But it possessed something that factored into the risk calculus of the United States, and that was that North Korea had a massive proportion of its forces forward deployed along the DMZ, along with artillery pieces, like over 10,000 artillery pieces, multiple rocket launchers deployed along the DMZ. And Seoul sits within range of that, just 30, 40 miles south of the DMZ. So when North Korea would threaten to turn Seoul into a sea of fire, it really wasn't just rhetorical. It was kind of a credible threat. So this posed an existential risk for both South Korea and the alliance that Washington had to take seriously. So leading into the first nuclear crisis, brinkmanship worked because escalation costs were unacceptable for the U.S. And then this dynamic, of course, culminates in the agreed framework of 1994. And so 1993, and this is where most consider North Korea's nuclear program kicking off. In fact, over years, it's actually been brewing. But a crisis kicks off when North Korea threatens to withdraw from the NPT in March 1993. And this crisis then draws in the United States into direct talks for the first time with Pyongyang. The first time the United States sort of throws out the policy, the rule book, and goes into direct negotiations with the United States. The crisis goes to the brink, with the U.S. actually seriously considering airstrikes on the Yongbyon complex. But again, due to the risks and the tremendous number of expected casualties, the U.S. opts for diplomacy. And so this results finally in the agreed framework in 1994, the implementation of which plays out throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. But the agreed framework it wasn't a treaty. So as an executive agreement, it was basically something that Bill Clinton signed up to. And so it was politically vulnerable, and it was fraught with implementation problems from the time it started. But from Pyongyang's perspective, it succeeds because it produces what they've always wanted, and that is direct negotiations with the United States. It slows external pressure. It buys time. And in doing so, North Korea preserves its nuclear program. It's able to explore during this time additional clandestine pathways. They start to develop a highly enriched uranium program, and then it is also at this point advancing in its ballistic missile development. So yes, I mean, North Korea's brinkmanship becomes institutionalized as this repeatable, very rational, calculated strategy that North Korea uses to achieve its negotiating and its nuclear goals. But I think most importantly, I think it reflects a regime that learned how to operate inside of the risk tolerance of its adversary, in this case, the United States, and very effectively.
And moving to the post 9/11 area, you discuss Kim Jong il's nuclear acquisition decisions. So, do you think how much did the US invasion of Iraq or the acts of this country's evil designating accelerate the shift from simply having a program to actually building the bomb?
Well, so the short answer, the axis of evil designation and the U.S. invasion of Iraq were in 2003. They were major determinants that accelerated this shift from simply maintaining fissile material to Kim Jong-un's full acquisition decision to test and field functional nuclear weapons as an operational capability, as an operational deterrent. And so the catalyst in acquiring a program is vastly different, because now you're acquiring the R&D, you're conducting tests, you're collecting data from those tests, you're rolling that data back into the test bank, and then you're performing additional tests and simulations and things that are rolling into this, because eventually this is going to lead to a fielded capability where the military winds up having to be trained in order to be able to use this capability. So it's a much different, it's a much deeper decision. And so the catalyst for this shift is September 11th. The attacks of September 11th, 2001, fundamentally shift, as we all know. It recalibrates U.S. foreign policy under the Bush administration. And the United States embraces what becomes known as, of course, the Bush Doctrine. And so the core tenets of the Bush Doctrine include preemptive war and unilateralism, the idea that the United States can act alone and topple a regime if it has to. And so, to thwart the support of terrorism on a global scale, and then to develop those that were suspected of developing weapons of mass destruction essentially were targeted. So all of this put North Korea directly in the crosshairs of post 9/11 U.S. foreign policy. And it's at this point that the U.S. and North Korea were still operating under the agreed framework. And so the framework is nearly at its end at this point, but they're still operating under the agreed framework. The plutonium program in Yongbyon, the 5-megawatt reactor that they had built, had been frozen, and it was being monitored by the IAEA. But by this time, through intelligence gathering, Washington becomes convinced that North Korea has a clandestine, highly enriched uranium program operating outside of the agreed framework. So it's not being looked at, it's not being monitored. And so North Korea has been essentially acquiring this HEU technology via the AQ-CON network. essentially a black market, a nuclear black market. And this was in exchange for ballistic missiles, another violation of international law, ballistic missiles being supplied surreptitiously to Pakistan. And so this plays into George Bush's January 2002 State of the Union speech, where he labels North Korea as part of the axis of evil. And then shortly thereafter, it was a Los Angeles Times leak of the U.S. nuclear posture review that showed North Korea being included in a list of 7 states that the United States was considering legitimate as a target for preemptive nuclear attack at the time. And so, and then in the same year, the U.S. National Security Strategies released explicitly framing North Korea as a WMD and missile threat and justifying preemptive action against it. And then in October, and in the very same year, a U.S. delegation travels to Pyongyang and essentially confronts North Korea about its HEU program. And then when confronted, North Korea admits it and said, instead of denying that they have a program and continuing to try and hide it, they admit it, and they cite Bush's axis of evil designation, the inclusion of U.S. nuclear targeting, and then being on the list, and then the U.S. doctrine of preemption as the reason that it was expanding its program. So this is a critical shift. And because the nuclear program is no longer merely a bargaining chip, it's now being openly framed. It's being framed at this point as deterrence, as justified self-defense against U.S. policy. And then comes the March 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, and Iraq is invaded. Why? To eliminate suspected WMD and to topple a regime, to conduct regime change. So from Pyongyang's perspective, this proves its point that, from its perspective, that as the U.S. is invading, so the U.S. is doing everything to Iraq that has become, North Korea's ultimate fear. So Kim Jong-il disappears during the invasion of Iraq. He disappears for about 7 weeks. And when he pops up, when he reemerges, North Korea announces that it possesses nuclear weapons. And it's adopted a policy at this point of nuclear deterrence, an official policy, a stated state policy of nuclear deterrence toward the United States. So this is the acquisition decision, the third, major decision that North Korea has made over its nuclear program. Iraq had essentially confirmed North Korea's worst fears, and from Kim Jong-il's perspective, the bomb is no longer an optional thing. It's insurance against regime change. So,
Dr. George, another questions come to my mind when we're discussing this topic. Why the United States didn't start with the Pyongyang instead of Iraq? Or is it a strategy to kill the chicken and scare the monkey first, starting with Iraq?
Yeah, that is, Lokman, that is an excellent question, because Iraq wound up not having weapons of mass destruction. Of course, North Korea had a nuclear program that it had developed surreptitiously. So there were much stronger grounds for going after North Korea, but the risk calculus was too great. North Korea had too strong a conventional capability arrayed against the DMZ. The cost that would be imposed on South Korea, let alone, the U.S.-South Korea alliance, was just too great. The U.S. was on the verge of attacking the Yongbyon complex, literally the day of a decision that the Clinton administration was about to make on that. Jimmy Carter had gone to Pyongyang and had struck a deal at the last minute with Kim Il-sung to continue to get North Korea back to. It was ironic that North Korea for years had been trying to get the United States to the negotiating table. Now Now it's the United States trying to get North Korea back to the negotiating table. And it's amazing what nuclear weapons will do for a state. But yeah, the cost was just too great, really, to attack North Korea, and the U.S. sort of fell into this trap of proving these points out.
And you described Kim Jong-un's area as a race against sanctions. So given Dr. Joe, could you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
I think I have some connection problem. Could you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Doctor, could you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Dr. Joe, could you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, okay. That is a connection issues. I'm experiencing some technical problem. Just let me repeat my question if you hear now.
Okay.
You come to the Kim Jong-un area. You describe Kim Jong-un area as a race against the sanctions. So given that they now have a developed arsenal, nuclear arsenal, is it fair to say they have won the race, or have sanctions failed to achieve the strategic goal, dismantling their nuclear weapons?
Yes. So on its own terms, yes. So Kim Jong-un won the race against sanctions. And this is probably, honestly, this is probably the most important, or most interesting anyway, part of the book. And that is the core purpose of the sanctions regime that began in 2006 under the UN Security Council Resolution 1718, and then all of its successor resolutions. It was to prevent North Korea from developing nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. And so by that metric, sanctions did not succeed. By 2018, Kim Jong-un declared North Korea's nuclear program complete. And I think it's important to distinguish that in this sense, winning, as far as winning the race, winning means surviving long enough to cross key technological thresholds, and then forcing adversaries, in this case, the United States, once North Korea has locked in these irreversible capabilities, forcing adversaries like the United States to deal with this new strategic reality. So consolidating this new set of circumstances that forces the United States into a new reality with each iteration. And so that's the standard that Kim Jong-un was racing toward. And after, it was the third nuclear test in 2013 where North Korea reaches an important internal milestone. It was right after that test that Pyongyang promulgates its nuclear weapons state law. This is 2013, and the law codifies rules. So basically it's doctrine, it's nuclear doctrine. It codifies rules for its nuclear use. It frames North Korea's nuclear arsenal as defensive and retaliatory, and then signals basically its refusal that it will denuclearize. But this is more or less a step change in North Korea's confidence. It's not really a full capability maturity at that point. So in 2013, North Korea does not have ICBMs. It doesn't have miniaturized warheads that it can integrate into missiles. And it has not integrated warheads. It hasn't developed the long-range delivery systems to be able to do this stuff. So how does a race against sanctions kick in? And this is kind of a key iterative type of cycle that North Korea latched onto in 2013. It was a self-reinforcing loop. And it kind of shows how sanctions may have actually perversely helped accelerate North Korea's nuclear program, because you start off with a nuclear missile test, a provocation. So a nuclear or a missile test is conducted. The UN responds with sanctions. Meanwhile, North Korean scientists, technicians collect data, analyze the data, technical refinements are made, they're incorporated, and then another test follows, usually more ambitious, more, bigger in scale than the previous one. And then the UN responds with tighter sanctions, and then so on and so on. And so instead of halting progress, sanctions compress this time loop. They give incentive to Pyongyang to accelerate testing and incorporate, take data, incorporate data-driven technical refinements as quickly as possible, so that works to hasten development before pressure from the sanctions becomes so unbearable that North Korea can't deal with it anymore. So it actually speeds them up. Now, did sanctions harm North Korea? Absolutely. So the sanctions absolutely harm the economy. Kim Jong-un actually acknowledged this publicly. It's documented that he cried in public over this, apologized to his people. But the pain
was the military parade.
Yeah, exactly. That's precisely right. And so the pain was, but it was asymmetric. The general he was apologizing to the general population. It was a general population that was suffering, people in the regions, but the elite in Pyongyang were not. They were largely insulated through all the illicit revenue streams, the cyber theft, the smuggling, the sanctions evasion. All this buffered the core elite in Pyongyang. So strategically, sanctions reinforced North Korea's siege narrative. So North Korea could look and say, look, this validates our claims of external hostility from the United States. And it justified further their nuclear acceleration as a survival imperative. And so we get to the 2017, 2018 window when we're seeing the harshest sanctions, crippling sanctions on North Korea. But this is precisely when North Korea conducts its thermonuclear tests, multiple ICBM tests, and then numerous integration trials in rapidity. And so in the meantime, between all of these tests, gets tighter and tighter and tighter. So Kim declares his nuclear force complete. This is 2018. And what does he signal? That he's ready to negotiate. All of this is happening on North Korea's terms. So sanctions failed in the sense that they didn't stop the program. Rather, they may have actually helped to define the finish line for Kim Jong-un. And once that threshold, once that finish line was crossed, the strategic balance fundamentally changes. Now it's the U.S. that's coming to the negotiating table.
And this is simply win. Yeah, they won the race.
Yes, in that respect.
And yes, come to your final chapter of the books. You mentioned the ripening of North Korea's nuclear doctrine. So what does a ripening doctrine look like? Does this mean they have moved past using nuclear solely of defense, from defense to the offensive purpose or coercive purpose?
Yes. if I heard you correctly, this is exactly what ripening means, Lokman. And the North Korea's nuclear doctrine had moved from 2013. It had moved beyond a narrow defensive deterrent. So it's evolved essentially into a more mature, flexible, more coercive doctrine aligned with expanded offensive capabilities. So a ripened doctrine essentially means one that has clearer rules for employment of nuclear weapons, a broader mission scope, and greater confidence in the full range of all the usable nuclear options. So from tactical through strategic. And so North Korea, it originally codified this posture in the nuclear weapons state law after its test in 2013. But again, that law framed nuclear weapons only as defensive and retaliatory, emphasizing deterrence. And so it signaled that North Korea possessed nuclear weapons, but at this stage, the bomb for North Korea is really a shield. And the real doctrinal shift comes in September 2022 with a new nuclear law, which fully replaces the 2013 law. And this new framework now explicitly authorizes preemptive nuclear use, introduces the use of and encourages the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and provides much greater detail on C2, command and control, decision-making authority, where the decision-making authority, who has the nuclear football, essentially, and conditions for use. So this is no longer just deterrence, it's operational offensive nuclear doctrine and its capability and intent that drive doctrine. And so North Korea now possesses, you know, it has ICBMs capable of ranging the U.S. homeland, which helps to deter the United States, but it short-range tactical systems that are suited for battlefield or theater use on the Korean Peninsula. And so while it has this dual-purpose nuclear posture where it can, while deterring the United States, it can coerce now or maintain escalatory dominance on locally on the Korean Peninsula. So nuclear weapons are no longer just about preventing regime collapse. And that's where a lot of, I think there's an argument in the scholarly literature about what is North Korea's program all about. Is it, well, it's regime survival. Well, that's only half the picture. It starts there, but now their tools, nuclear weapons, are tools to shape escalation, coerce adversaries, and manage conflict, manage the dynamics around conflict below the threshold of full-scale war. So, in other words, now, so the bombs become both a shield and a sword.
And the books argues that North Korea plans to exploit a increasingly multipolar international order. As we see the rise of the blocs like the China, Russia, North Korea, and maybe Iran to some extent, versus the West. So does this global disorder actually make the North Korea more safer or more powerful than it has been in decades?
I think there's no doubt about it, Lokman. An increasingly multipolar order, the likes of what we see now, has made North Korea much safer and much more powerful than it's been in decades, possibly than it's ever been. Because, but it's also made the Korean Peninsula more dangerous and less predictable. And this gets lost, I think, because, the world kind of moves along, but developments are occurring. You've got an order right now that's rapidly changing. And so you have block alignments that are forming. And as you eloquently mentioned, you've got China and Russia and arguably Iran North Korea. The crink is what many refer to that as. So now that North Korea is equipped with ICBMs ranging the United States and an offensive nuclear doctrine, it no longer prioritizes direct dialogue with Washington. So it spends decades trying to get to the negotiating table with Washington. Now it's Washington trying to get to talks with North Korea. And North Korea, frankly, has reallocated its foreign policy capital, the same resources that it would use to harness discussions, a capability essentially to focus on discussions with the United States. That's been reallocated. It's now being aligned toward foreign policy with Russia and China. And that's a tremendous strategic pivot. So from bargaining with the United States in a U.S.-led system to now embedding itself inside a rival nuclear bloc, which it's part of. They're all nuclear powers, with the exception of Iran, which is possibly on the way, which challenges this U.S. system. So multipolarity plays into this, making North Korea safer, certainly, because we're in a fragmented order right now, and as norms weaken, consensus continues to erode, and North Korea is a spoiler in the system. And as this erosion occurs, it's got more room to maneuver. So, yeah. And, in Russia's case, cooperation with North Korea has deepened and across every single domain: political, military, economic, cultural. And this is what gives Pyongyang its safety, its diplomatic insulation, economic relief, strategic credibility. And where this is most alarming is North Korea has designated South Korea, keeping in mind China and Russia aren't paying attention to upholding international sanctions as they had been up until a few years ago against North Korea and its nuclear program. But where it's most alarming is North Korea has designated South Korea as an enemy state. And in doing so, it's abandoned reunification as a goal that would be found in its constitution. And it's replaced that with a policy of subjugation and annexation as its new policy towards South Korea. And that language is very, very important, because subjugation implies what? Coercive control. And annexation implies absorption of the southern half of the peninsula into North Korea's legal and constitutional framework, its political system. So this is a de facto claim of sovereignty over all of Korea, backed by, you look at the map, and there's China, there's Russia, there's North Korea. And so you've got a nuclear escalatory capability there that's really, terrible to say, but it's really unmatched right now in Northeast Asia. And it all sort of hinges on an extended deterrence capability that the United States provides, which is good. But I don't know that the allies are as reassured as they'd like to be when it comes to that. So again, why does multipolarity benefit Pyongyang? In the previous bipolar and unipolar systems, North Korea was isolated, it was pressured, it had to negotiate. But in this multipolar system, North Korea, it's a useful partner. It's a military supplier of Russia's war in Ukraine. It's a strategic irritant to the West. And so nuclear status has given it tremendous value in this rival bloc. And multipolarity has only worked to embolden North Korea's strategic outlook. With nuclear weapons are now a central pillar to its strategy. And here's the kicker. If this trajectory continues, should the international order continue to undergo these transformative changes, along the current trajectory that we're seeing, and especially if these changes result in a disruption to U.S. South Korea to the alliance, particularly the military alliance. North Korea has postured its position to pursue peninsular hegemony.
And Doctor, it's increasingly advancement in its nuclear arsenal in both in quantity and quality. Now they give another concern on the U.S. ally, especially the Japan and South Korea. Now that trigger the public, even to some extent in the decision-makers level, to push these nations to build their indigenous nuclear weapon and combine this nuclear arsenal with the technological development and the cooperation with Russia. I think bring another layer of concern to the South Korea and Japan.
Absolutely. And that concern right now is playing out in real time. If you'll recall, during the APEC, around the edges of the APEC summit, President Trump met with President Lee and gave approval for a nuclear submarine to be built. And this has sparked, concern on the part of China. Of course, China's going to push back on that. North Korea has condemned that, but they see that as the potential for North Korea or for South Korea to enter the pursuit of nuclear weapons technology. Now, I think South Korea is more sophisticated than to launch into something like that recklessly. But look, it's a democracy. And if the people, every poll that's taken in South Korea, about 70% of the public is always behind the idea of South Korea developing its own indigenous nuclear weapons. So if politicians are paying attention to the people, at some point, when does that become a political reality, a campaign promise, let's say, from an opposition, say, a politician that wants to get elected, makes a promise, and then before you know it, you've got this issue on your hands. So, and Japan, it really is following a similar track right now. There's news right now. Of course, you see the tensions that are going on between China and Japan over Taiwan, and part of that rhetoric, I think there was an official that spoke recently and made mention of Japan ought to look into its own nuclear weapons. So this is out there. It's on the table. It's out in the open.
And thank you very much, Dr. George, for sharing your valuable insight with my audiences and talking about your books. It's a really,
well, thank you.
Great conversation, and I just put it the link of the books at the description for my audiences who want to order. I just put it the Amazon book links. You can order these amazing books: North Korea's Nuclear Decisions and Strategies, Sovereignty, Legitimacy, and the Bomb. And especially for those who are working on the Korean Peninsula and interested with the geopolitics or the nuclear weapons proliferation of Northeast Asia, definitely you should find these books and read.
Thank you so much, Lokman. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate you allowing me to talk about the information that was in the book.
You're welcome. You're most welcome, Dr. George, and your insights are really valuable. Maybe they are coming through the experience of the decades. And really, it's a great pleasure to listen to you. And also, thank you for my audiences who are listening the show until now. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel, support our shows, and share the link of the videos with your networks. And waiting for more amazing live streams about the international politics and critical developments around the world. Stay safe and have a good holiday, and see you on the next episode.